Good evening, everyone. My name is Amarilys Estrella, and I am an assistant professor of anthropology, as well as a faculty affiliate for the Center for African and African American Studies at Rice University. I'd like to welcome you all this evening to our event titled Haiti, Past, Present, and Future, with our distinguished panelists, Dr. Reginald DeRoche, Dr. Sophie Sapmore, and Mr. Sledge Leonidas. This event is being hosted by the Center for African and African American Studies at Rice University, and it is sponsored by the Southeastern Texas African and African American Studies Consortium. Developed in 2021, the consortium involves cooperation between Prairie View University, Rice University, Texas Southern University, and the University of Houston. The consortium's goal is to foster outward-facing curriculum, research, and programming that expands and deepens attention to the thought and practices of people of African descent within this region. While each of these four institutions has done important work related to this goal, the synergy possible through this partnership serves only to expand the range of conversation partners, collaborators, and impact, and in this way enhance this region's participation in the national African and African American Studies conversation. Before we begin, I want to just share a little bit about the format for tonight's event. Each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes, which will then be followed by an exchange with me and the moderator. And then we will open it up for Q&A to the audience. We'd like to encourage the audience to write your questions in the chat as the speakers throughout the evening. And then we'll use those questions at the end to ask of our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist of the evening, Dr. Reginald DeRoche. Dr. Reginald DeRoche, who was named president of Rice University beginning July 2022, is currently provost of Rice University. In this role, Dr. DeRoche serves as the chief academic officer of the university and its 7,500 students, 7 schools, and more than 700 faculty. His primary research interests are in the design of resilient infrastructure systems under extreme loads and the application of smart materials. His research is highly interdisciplinary and spans micro to macro scales. Welcome, Dr. DeRoche.
Thank you very much, Amarilys, and thank you for inviting me to be here with everybody today. I want to talk a little bit about the earthquake. I am an earthquake engineer, and I am also Haitian. I was born in Haiti, grew up in the US, and traveled to Haiti shortly after the earthquake and was active in the response for many years following the 2010 Haiti earthquake. And I just want to briefly talk about my experiences there, what we've learned, and how that earthquake in many ways was not a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster in Haiti. And obviously we'll take questions after that. And so this is one of my favorite James Baldwin's quotes that talks about history and how history is present with us today. And I think certainly the Haiti earthquake speaks to that in terms of how Haiti's history as a first freed Black nation really planted a seed in many ways for the disaster that occurred in 2010. It was a magnitude 7 earthquake. That might not mean much to anybody who's not an earthquake engineer, but it was really a moderate earthquake that had devastating impacts with over 250,000 people dead, possibly more, 300,000 injured, 1.5 million homeless. People left homeless, largest natural disaster in the Western Hemisphere in modern times, and certainly a catastrophic disaster for the Haitian people. And everybody knows Haiti is certainly one of the poorest countries in the world and the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. And we see here some statistics that speak to the poverty that exists in Haiti, which really, in some ways, planted the seed for unfortunately, the earthquake that occurred in 2010 and the disaster that followed. Again, another quote that I like to put up as it relates to the earthquake is, again, Haiti's present situation, certainly after the earthquake, was a product of its history. And as a first free Black nation, that resulted in a series of events that led to Haiti being shunned by the international community and a history of poverty that resulted from that. which helped lead to, unfortunately, the disaster that occurred in Haiti. This is the cost that was imposed on Haiti following their 1804 and freeing themselves, and that's equivalent to around $25 billion in today's currency, 2.5 times the GDP of Haiti. I want to talk a little bit about the earthquake. I spent about 10 days right after the earthquake, around 5 days after the earthquake, in Haiti. We were part of a group that was on the ground shortly after the event, primarily looking at trying to help understand which buildings were safe enough to reoccupy and which ones were not, particularly schools and hospitals and other critical facilities at the time. Again, as a reminder, this earthquake was devastating by all measures in terms of the number of casualties that it sustained, historic and the deadliest earthquake in the Western Hemisphere in modern history. Part of the challenge with Haiti is obviously it's an extremely densely populated country. The city of Port-au-Prince is extremely densely populated. And you can see here there was lots of buildings that had collapsed in and around the city, buildings that were on the countryside and built using materials that really are hard to sustain the impacts of the earthquake. This is, again, this is where we stayed following the earthquake. There were no hotels that were open at the time. This is a picture showing the fault structure. This is what we believe was the fault line of the earthquake. And why that's important is because you rarely see earthquakes occur so close to densely populated cities, and that the purple part is where you have the majority of the population in Haiti. And you can see here, this line shows where the faulting occurred during the earthquake, which means the largest shaking occurred in that region, in the densely populated city of Port-au-Prince. There was damage to pretty much all types of structures. This is a warehouse. There were many tens of warehouses like this that stored significant amount of food that was perishable. And part of what we were there to do was to understand whether or not these buildings sustained so much damage that they couldn't be occupied or entered. And we had to make decisions about whether or not it was safe to enter these buildings to be able to retrieve the food that was in there. This is the Ministry of Justice courthouse, where it was a complete collapse of the structure. We were asked to go inside the structure to obtain critical documents of prisoners that actually had escaped the city that were missing, and the documents in the courthouse had the addresses for them to try to find those that had escaped the local prison. This is an example of a ministry building. Nearly every ministry building, which was located again in Port-au-Prince, sustained catastrophic damage. This building had to be demolished and rebuilt following the earthquake. I think the saddest part of the earthquake and the result of the earthquake was the number of children that died. Roughly 1/3 of the deaths that occurred in Haiti, again, 250,000 people that died, around 1/3 or more were less than 17 years old. The earthquake occurred at a time where children were still in school, right before the end of the day, and that resulted in what you see here in terms of a complete collapse of a concrete building. And I think in this particular building, there were 40 children that were presumed dead in this particular structure. You know, many lessons from this earthquake. Clearly, one was just the types of design that are used in Haiti. One of the challenges a place like Haiti has, and much of the Caribbean actually has, is because of the prevalence of hurricanes. The hurricane design philosophy is quite different from the earthquake design philosophy. You want heavy structures for hurricanes. You want light, flexible structures for earthquakes. And so you see many structures like this in parts of the Caribbean that do not fare well in earthquakes because of the heavy floors and the heavy roof structures. And so part of the challenge is educating the population around how you build for these dual hazards that tend to be prevalent in parts of the Caribbean and South America in terms of hurricanes and earthquakes. Again, very heavy structure, which this kind of building is great for high winds and hurricanes, but not great for earthquakes because of the heavy mass that we have on top here. The other challenge in Haiti was not having adequate steel materials within the concrete. You probably need twice as much steel in this location to be able to sustain the shaking that we have from earthquakes. Probably in my opinion anyway, the most common reason for failure was the quality of the materials in and around Haiti. When you make concrete, it's a combination of sand, cement, and rock, and then you mix it with water. And in this case, there was too much water. The mixtures weren't appropriate for sustaining the loads, resulting in weak concrete. And we found that the concrete in Haiti was roughly a third to a half of the strength that you would need to be able to sustain the adequate forces that you would get from an earthquake there. And this was really, in my opinion, the biggest reason you saw widespread failure in and around the city. The other challenge in Haiti is because of the deforestation that has occurred over the last couple of decades. There wasn't enough wood to have wood structures. And why that's important, and if you look at the next slide, this is a wooden home in Haiti, and right next to it was a concrete home. And you can see the wooden home is still standing. The concrete home is completely collapsed. Because they're in the same location, we know that they had the same level of shaking at the base, but yet one is standing and one is collapsed, which speaks to the fragility of concrete buildings relative to wood buildings. Wood buildings being light, they tend to fare much better in earthquakes. Yet again, in Haiti, because of the lack of wood, it was difficult to have a number of buildings that were built in this fashion. One of the other challenges that occurred in the earthquake was just the large amount of debris. This earthquake produced more debris than any other natural hazard up to that time anywhere in the world. And the debris was there for months on end, and there wasn't an effort to remove the debris. And so my colleagues and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and you see this date here, July 7th. At that point, very little of the debris had been removed. Less than 5% of the debris had been removed and was still in the streets. And we wrote an op-ed about the importance of removing debris for a country to recover from a natural disaster, and that ended up having a pretty significant impact. They changed the approach after that, brought in heavy equipment, and really moved things forward. And the debris was removed in a fairly timely fashion following this article that we wrote. Again, just, and I'm wrapping up here, just Haiti's history in many ways was present on the date of the earthquake in 2010, and is present in Haiti to this day in many ways. We often talk about resilience, and I'm wrapping up here. One of the things that struck me the most spending time in Haiti following the earthquake was how resilient the people of Haiti were after the earthquake. And this is just, again, a few days after the earthquake. There were still people that were deceased in buildings, and yet you saw the people were so resilient and moving on with their lives and trying to recover. We met so many people that had lost their entire family and were still working to move forward. And so it really spoke to just how resilient the people of Haiti are because of how much they've been through over the centuries. And again, people were selling art on the street less than 2 weeks after the earthquake, which again speaks to the incredible courage and the resilience of the people of Haiti. I learned a lot from being part of that trip. I took roughly 10 trips to Haiti after the earthquake for a variety of different projects to help with the recovery and the long-term recovery of Haiti and the rebuilding of Haiti. I'm hopeful, I'm very hopeful that Haiti will move forward in a more prosperous and resilient fashion. So again, thank you for your time, and happy to answer questions when the panel convenes.
Thank you, Dr. DeRoche. And I'm looking forward to hearing more during our Q&A and discussion. I'd like to now introduce our second panelist, Dr. Sophie Sapp-Moore. Dr. Sophie Sapp-Moore holds a PhD in Cultural Studies from UC Davis with a designated emphasis in critical theory, and is currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in environmental justice at Rice University. Her research addresses how power shapes rural environments with a particular focus on the political ecology of agrarian change in the post-colonial Caribbean. She uses ethnographic and historical methods to understand changing formations of power, knowledge, and capital in the Afro-Americas. Welcome, Dr. Moore.
Great. Thank you so much, Amarilys, and thank you everybody for having me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. DeRoche and Mr. Leonidas and our audience. So I guess I just want to start by saying I think, I'm taking a very different approach from Dr. DeRoche, but we have a similar goal in the phrase that I noted earlier on in the slides, getting to the root of the destruction. And I'm looking to go like way back in what I present today to talk about the early 19th century through the American occupation and some of the roots that lead to the present status of Haiti today. So I have a PowerPoint with some slides. I'm going to share that. Go back to the beginning. Everybody see that? Great. So I guess I want to start just by talking about what I'm doing on this panel, because I'm not Haitian and I don't live in Haiti, and I haven't in fact been to Haiti since 2018. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I came to my study and what I think I have to offer in this discussion. And then, as Amarilys noted, the focus of my work is on environmental justice. That's what I teach at Rice, and that's sort of become one of the core categories in my work. So I'm going to focus on what we can learn by focusing an environmental justice lens on Haiti and on Haiti's history. And ultimately, I'm looking for us to think about the forms of anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggle that have been rooted in Haiti since the 18th century or before. Then I'm actually going to take up something that has been brought up already briefly, is deforestation. And I want to think about that as an example of the ways that Haiti makes more complex crisis narratives and the way we think about intervention on the hemispheric scale. I guess I'll start a little bit about me. I've been a scholar of the Caribbean and of Haiti more specifically for many years. As I'm sure everybody is aware, some geopolitical pressures and the pressures of the pandemic have made it impossible to conduct my research as I normally do. I've been doing ethnographic research in Haiti since 2012. I haven't been able to do that in some time, so I'm also incorporating more archival work into what I'm doing now. So as was noted in my intro, I'm a political ecologist. For me, that's kind of in between geography and anthropology. I study how power shapes environments. And so when I think about power in that context, I'm thinking about colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, how those operate on the hemisphere more broadly, but specifically on Haiti. And the environments that interest me most particularly are agrarian environments, so places where people work the land, grow food, and grow staple crops. And I came to study Haiti in a really roundabout way, because what I was really interested in was the ecological impacts of colonialism and empire. And ultimately, I found that I couldn't understand that in the hemispheric context without understanding Haiti's history more deeply. In my work, I look at geographies that emerge at the conjuncture of processes of political transformation and ecological transformation. So one example would be the development of smallholder agriculture after the Haitian Revolution. rural people in Haiti usually call themselves peasants, paysans. And so I'm interested in how that developed in the context of ending the plantation system in Haiti. Another example would be the attempted incorporation of Haiti into US empire during the occupation, which was 1915 to 1934. And a third would be the present conjuncture. So I just wanted to mention a little bit, just that Haitians are suffering through a period right now of very intense political upheaval, public health crisis due to COVID and other factors, and ongoing impacts of natural or unnatural disasters in a rapidly changing climate. So, the least of concerns related to that is that I haven't been able to visit Haiti in a while. Typically, I work in central Haiti. I haven't been able to go there since 2018. And I don't feel I really have a position to speak from on the present status of Haiti or what it's like to be in Haiti now, as I haven't been in so long. But what I do want to talk about is what Haiti's history illuminates or complicates about broader struggles for justice and for liberation in the hemisphere. And I think about one of the big themes of my work, which is how liberatory spaces emerge. So, see, I'll tell you just a little bit about the place where I work. This first picture is the High Central Plateau. So it's the area like north of Mirabale and many hours from Cap Haitian, kind of in the middle of the country. You see this red marker is the village where I work. The core of my work has been ethnographic work with a peasants movement called the Mouvement Paysan Papai, the Peasants Movement of Papai, where that red marker is in central Haiti. So I could talk more about the movement if that's something that we're interested in discussing later. This is just a flyer for their 25th anniversary. They've been around since the 70s, since the early 70s, and played a pretty major role in the fall of the dictatorship in 1986. So this is from the movement archives. When I do my work with the movement, I spend a lot of time in these kind of situations. So the movement has a farm school where students learn agroecology and they undertake political education. It's kind of on the pedagogy of the oppressed model, like Freirean pedagogy from Brazil. So that's the classroom aspect. They've taken those trainings. And then there's the field aspect, the practical aspect, which is where students learn to practice agroecology, the creation of sustainable food systems. And so here are some students out in the field learning about erosion control and how to farm on sloped surfaces. That's kind of what I do in the field. I could talk more about some current research projects that this work inspired, but I think I'm just going to move on to thinking more specifically about environmental justice in Haiti. So I came to thinking about that because I've been teaching and writing about environmental justice as a way of understanding the experience of rural Black people in the Americas more broadly. And that came into play in coming to the Gulf Coast and thinking about solidarities across the hemisphere. But it connected to my work in Haiti and thinking about the Green Revolution. And that's a set of interventions that started, we could say, as early as the 60s for intensification of production, primarily of food crops, but also other staple crops. This included rice intensification in the Artibonite Valley. There's a lot more I could say about that, but what I'm interested in fundamentally is how the Green Revolution transformed Haiti's agrarian geographies and how that transformation created grounds to advance the project of US empire. So this isn't just a story of how the Green Revolution came to Haiti and how the US expanded its empire in the Caribbean. It's also a story about the present, about how food insecurity and hunger have been augmented by that intervention. I can get more specific about that if folks are interested in talking about it. But at the same time, I really want to emphasize that this wasn't an uncontested process, and that Haitian peasants have been growing food crops, including rice, but also millet, sorghum, maize, peanuts, a lot of other crops in a very integrated fashion in the interior for several hundred years, right? And so the ways that rural people experience the Green Revolution gives us some demonstration of a tradition of agrarian justice that has its roots like in the 19th century. one concept that's really important to me in thinking about that comes from sociologist Jean Casimir, a Haitian sociologist. And in his work, he develops a concept that he refers to as the counterplantation. And he links that to the way that rural people were the descendants of enslaved people and had fought in the revolution, sought to make a free agrarian culture in Haiti's interior after the revolution. And so he calls that rural culture the counterplantation. And what I'm interested in is thinking about how that concept reverberates in the present. So how we can think about how unmaking colonialism and empire is something that articulates with Haiti's present. And something that I'm really invested in doing is changing the kind of, or questioning, challenging the kind of narratives that we use to talk about Haiti. And one of the ways that I do that is to focus on abundance in my work. And I'm not saying that, you know, in a Pollyanna-ish way, it's like we should ignore things that are bad and talk about abundance, right? It's something that makes more complex the narrative that we have about Haiti and crisis, about hunger and poverty and destruction and suffering, right? And so something that I have seen in my work and that I really want to highlight is how Haitians themselves have sought to unmake the forces that put them into the conditions under which they suffer in the present. And that's been a perpetual effort for several hundred years. So I just, excuse me, want to think a little bit about deforestation. And this picture is probably familiar because it appeared in a previous slide. And I want to talk about this image a bit because it circulates quite extensively. And the region where I work is just slightly out of this picture. Maybe, you know, on this map, it would be maybe, or on this picture, it would be maybe an inch off the left-hand side. And something that I think about a lot is when I look at historical photos of the region, right, like from the teens, from the 20s, from the 30s, that area is not forested. And so I'm wanting to challenge the idea that this area of Haiti just to the west of the Dominican border should be forested in the way that we imagine it should be when we see what's on the right. And I'm not alone in this challenge. A friend of mine published a pretty incendiary piece a couple years ago called Haiti is Covered with Trees. And it depended on some Landsat data of vegetative cover on the entire island. And the conclusions of the piece were that Haiti was approximately as covered with vegetation as it should be, according to the climate, the geography, the geology of the region. That's not to say that deforestation isn't happening, but it challenges the idea that it's massive and total, and that we can draw a clear dividing line between this is how it should be and this is how it is. This on the left is a crisis and this on the right is how it should be. And so if you spend any time in Haiti at all, you'll see dozens, maybe hundreds of reforestation efforts. Some of those come with USAID or USDA tags on them. The vast majority of them come with the NGO name behind them. Reforestation is a massive, massive undertaking in Haiti. And I want to think about what it does that this narrative that Haiti is massively deforested, what it does that circulates as the way that we understand the ecology of the island. When in fact, deforestation is underway, but it's not underway in the way that narrative would present. So I'm really talking from, I guess, what I've encountered as peasants' frustration at a lack of understanding of what they themselves are doing, as they do cut trees, but they also plant a lot of trees themselves. They've tended tree nurseries since the 70s. And I want us to understand that as a political question, the idea of a crisis narrative of deforestation is very much tied up with how US actors and other international or NGO actors wish to intervene in Haiti. For example, in the coup of 1991, the military junta was very present on the Central Plateau, and they cut down all the trees in MPP's tree nursery, calling them communist trees. And friends I spoke to, because they opposed the junta, right? They opposed the military occupation of the country and the removal of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And so what I'm getting at is that like this understanding of Haiti as in a crisis of deforestation is a political narrative, and it serves a particular purpose. And what I see when I'm in central Haiti is the ways that how Haitians interact with the land and with their environment is challenging that. And I'm just going to show you one quick example. To me, I refer to this as a tree plantation. In NGO or in USAID literature, they might use the same words. They also explicitly refer to these kind of trees, acacia trees, as junk trees. And so these are the trees that came with the Green Revolution and were used to create timber plots where peasants could harvest wood, right? If you're thinking about that photo on the right side of the Dominican border, it doesn't look anything like the tropical forest that you might imagine, right? The trees are spindly, there's no canopy, they're evenly spaced, they're clearly intended to be harvested. But if I think about these trees in the context of the counter plantation concept that I had introduced before, really see how peasants movements like MPP have adopted this mode of planting that came in as an international intervention to serve for their own purposes. And so I don't necessarily have an answer to this question, but I'm asking, how can we understand the cultivation of liberatory possibilities, even within something that doesn't look like what we expect it to look like, right? And so I'm thinking about these sort of very tidy rows of scrawny trees. And they help me sort of to think more deeply about how we see formations of power and capital in Haiti and how we see Haitian actors themselves intervening in those at different scales across the country and across the span of history. That's what I have for today. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. And I just want to say I have my own copy here of Jean Casimir's The Haitians, which has been translated, A Decolonial History, for anyone interested in it.
Highly recommended.
Highly recommended. So now we'll move on to our third and final panelist for this evening, Mr. Sledge Leonidas. Mr. Sledge Leonidas is an entrepreneur and public health professional with a diverse background and several years experience in business administration and project management. He has been instrumental in forming Houston Haitians United and sits as chairman of the board. He also served on the board of director of Houston Caribbean Professional I might have skipped something there. He also serves on the board of director of Houston Caribbean Professional Association as chairman. Mr. Leonidas is actively involved in public service internationally and locally, providing healthcare consultation, community development, and mentoring youth. Welcome, Mr. Leonidas.
Thank you all for having me. It's an honor to sit on such an esteemed panel alongside Dr. DeRoche and Dr. Moore. I enjoyed the conversation and how it's being conducted. Every panelists had some points that they made, and they were very good and educational. I want to shift a little to speak on the more cultural aspect in Haiti, speak on the migrant crisis also, and how Haiti has been instrumental in the past and in the present currently, and tie those all in. First, as we know, we've, it's been said many times that we were the first Black independent nation to be recognized and took our independence. We took it, it wasn't given by France. So, when you're talking about taking something from someone, there's consequences for that. So we had Napoleon, who was an explorer. They said that he discovered so many different things, but to me, he was just an explorer that came upon something that was already established. So he didn't actually discover it, right? Maybe it was new to the other parts of the world, but not new to the inhabitants of the region. So I say that to say, in taking the independence, we definitely bankrupt Napoleon and his entourages. And so now, how do you make up for that? And France is losing a whole lot of money at this point, so they have to, find a way to recapture that money that's been now taken away from their plantations. So of course, this tariff has been imposed on Haiti, and these penalties are stating that, hey, you guys have to pay us this money back for the monies that we would have made on you, you know, if you were still under the arms of slavery. And of course, you know, that bankrupt our purses. And so now no government can properly operate, I don't care who it is, without a purse. You know, so if you're taking more than 80% of the gross incomes from different sectors, whether it's farming or any other industry, you can see how it can really trickle down and cripple the low man on the totem pole, such as the paysans who often stayed on the countrysides of Haiti, and they were the farmers. They were really the ones that were the workers on the land. So, you know, in doing so, now Haiti as a country has to find creative ways on how to maintain. Now, you know, for me as a Haitian, you know, I don't really like to divulge into conspiracy theories or whatnot, but there are powers that may be out there that definitely played a role in the continuation of the crippling of the Haitian economy. In the when President Clinton was, you know, in power in the U.S., he, you know, put in some rice that, you know, crippled the Haitian market. So they just flooded the market with subsidized rice. So now farmers could not compete with free rice in essence, you know. So now the Haitian rice became way more expensive. And then now the poorer people could not afford that. They couldn't afford to feed their children, you know, from the rice that was being grown in the country. So you'll see, you know, and then Clinton has since, you know, apologized for doing that. And he said if he could do it again, he would do it differently. You know, so we had, Haiti has had many different, you know, factors that's put it in the economic crisis that's it seems to be perpetually in. And then of course we had the catastrophe of the 2010 earthquake. Like Dr. DeRoche, I, you know, myself was down there with my organizations and my family's down there as well, doing great works on the countrysides, from clinics that we've done, and, you know, and putting in systems to help the community sustain itself from, you know, farming and building homes and giving them, you know, jobs that will, you know, help sustain themselves down there. So we've been fundamentally part of the rebuilding of Haiti. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, you know, to 2021, the crisis that was there at Del Rio, how did this all happen? You know, so now I took you guys from, you know, the independence in 1804 all the way to now 2021. I'll get to 22, but 21, just for time references. And so it's like, if you're imagining a fast-paced reel, we like fast forwarded real quickly, right? So now we have the border crisis at Del Rio. These migrants actually left Haiti in 2010 to find better opportunities in South America, places like Brazil and Chile. And, you know, that's where they were predominantly. But those economies weren't prepared for the influx of migration, Haitian migration to their country. So some of the, you know, the economy couldn't sustain. So now it's like, okay, now what do we do? So they risk crossing so many different countries, 6 to 8 countries, to get to the US border through Mexico, right there at Del Rio. My organization, Houston Haitians United, answered that call. And we were able to, if they were about 15,000 that were there supposedly under the bridge, we helped assist about 2,500 of those, give or take, migrants, from providing them legal services free of cost, from providing them shelter, and also buying plane tickets for them to go to, from their one destination to the next, and connecting them with family. So overnight, the organization became a social services, for the community. And, we've had a great influx of donors that wanted to contribute, from volunteers, people that were flying here and there, different universities wanted to participate with us, and from Harvard Law to Yale, that wanted to give free services as well. So that is going to be a continuation and ongoing process, to be able to help these migrants. All right. So I'm going to go back a little bit. So now, after we've gained our independence, we know that Haitians has always been a very proud people. Proud, why? The cultural impact that we've had on just the Black freedom has been great. We have countries such as Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela, which Haiti has played a role into their liberation. So Haiti has also been known as the mother of liberation. So if Haiti does not succeed, Black liberation everywhere, in essence, suffers. So that's why I always challenge, everyone, every country, that is a sovereign country, to participate in the advancement of, the Haitian struggle, because the debt that Haiti has paid to freedom, I feel that it is now time for other countries to, get on the same boat, to, galvanize and move things forward, help the country move forward. We've played roles in, there was a Chicago was founded by a Haitian, Point du Sable, and then the Battle of Savannah, which really was an instrumental battle, because had the Haitian soldiers, I think it was maybe like 400 or so, 300, 400 soldiers, I can't remember the exact number, that came from Haiti. Had they not played a role in the Battle of Savannah, maybe, we were still, playing Dixie, strolling around in rebel flags. And then, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. That's why you see a very strong, cultural connection between Louisiana and Haiti. I call the people of Louisiana the real Haitian Americans, just because of that cultural ties. So the impact of Haiti has been great. The struggle is still there, but the people are very resilient people, and Haiti will thrive. So the other panelists made some points that I wanted to go back to. In regards to the deforestation of Haiti. So the people really use the wood to warm themselves and to cook. They use it for coal. Why are they doing that? Because the electrical grids doesn't reach out there to the countryside, right? And also there has been other entities that have played a role in the deforestation of Haiti as well. That was, for their benefit, financial benefit in different industries. But as a Haitian, I want to thank you all for allowing us the opportunity to speak to the audience, to just, shed some light. If you all never been to Haiti, sometimes people say, hey, don't go to Haiti right now. The country is unstable. There are some insecurities in Haiti, but my family is down there. There's people that still go down there to visit. The country is moving forward. It's advancing, even still in the struggles that it faces.
Thank you, Mr. Lunius, for your presentation, and thank you to all three panelists. I'd like to encourage our audience to include questions in the chat, which we can ask of our panelists. But for now, we can get started with just a few questions that I also had for you based on your presentations. And I think one of the ones that I keep thinking about and want to bring back to all of you is that for me, as someone whose family connections on the island of Haiti are actually on the eastern side, what we refer to as the Dominican Republic, I have found myself working in solidarity with Haitian migrants and the children of Haitian migrants, Dominicans of Haitian descent, for quite some time, and thinking about what it means to amplify their voices, to think about any systemic racism, and in their particular experience, being recognized as citizens. And I know that we're talking about diasporas in different spaces, but the word that keeps coming back to me is solidarity, and also, as Dr. Moore mentioned, abundance. And I'm wondering for each of you, from where you stand, your positionalities, your work, what do you envision that solidarity to look like? What does it mean for you? And perhaps even to think a little bit about abundance as we think about Haiti's future as well. And anyone can go.
I guess oh, go ahead, please.
Solidarity is definitely a key in the advancement of into Haiti's future. We have several countries that have, such as Venezuela and some other countries as well, that has stepped up, that says that, for a while, there was talks of Haiti joining the African Union. And so those talks only commenced because outside of the continent of Africa, Haiti is the closest in the roots. We have kept our cultural roots the longest. How is that possible? That was possible because we've freed ourselves from tyranny way longer. We were independent way longer, so we're able to, hold on to some of those cultural roots, whereas to colonization for an extended period of time, of course, those cultures starts to blend. But the solidarity comes in the thought processes that we, surrounding countries, can do more. America can do more. France can do more. If any country is going to do more, I think it starts with France, first and foremost. But there were talks into addressing Haiti has sent formal requests via diplomatic measures to receive some of those monies back into our coffers. Of course, those requests have been denied and not have been met. But anyways, outside of that, there's room for economic development for us in the diaspora to go and help develop the country. We're building a hospital on the outskirts of Haiti, on the northern part of Haiti, and also in a place called Jiggy, which is on the southern coast of Haiti, and building a school as well. So I know the NGOs are down there and they play a major role in some of the development, but I think the private sectors can also play a role into the advancement of the development in Haiti. The previous administration, before the assassination of the president Jovenel Moise, one of his terms were that Haiti is open for business. Now, under the new administration being led by the Prime Minister Ariel Henry, they are still in diplomatic talks to bring in outside entities into Haiti. So yes, that sense of unity definitely has to be there.
Amarilys, I would say, just to add to that, I think there are two aspects I would add. One is the solidarity within the country. I think Haiti suffers from, as do many Caribbean and other nations, of sort of racism within and classism within Haiti, right? The light skin versus the dark skin. And there are historical reasons for that, but that I think it's deeper in Haiti than in perhaps many other countries, Caribbean countries, and even the U.S. The sort of the class differences, and part of that related to the skin color and the historical legacies of others coming to Haiti and having economic benefits relative to those that have been in Haiti for a while. And that has to end for Haiti to move forward in many ways, I believe. And the other, as was mentioned by Sledge, is the solidarity that needs to exist between the Haitians in the U.S. and in Canada, because there are many Haitians in Canada, and those Haitians in Haiti, the diaspora here in the U.S. And there needs to be stronger solidarity because there are so many of us that are here in the U.S. that really can do more to support what's going on in Haiti.
I think, the point that I wanted to make was that a point I'm emphasizing in my work is that I don't think solidarity can exist on a neo-colonial foundation, right? And so I'm wanting to link solidarity and sovereignty, and that in efforts that intervene in the sovereign nation of Haiti, its politics, its practices, the way people live, how they want to run their country, if they are to be in solidarity, need to respect the way that Haitians are already organizing and the practices and processes that they've had in place since before the revolution even. And one example would be, again, to return to deforestation, and what I think all three of us have been talking about is like, why do we need to get to the root causes of destruction, of crisis, of declension narratives? Well, because the root of deforestation is colonial timber extraction, and part of that debt that was mentioned that was paid to France was paid in teak and mahogany that was extracted from the interior of the country. And so to talk about deforestation in Haiti and say, oh, reforestation is a solidarity act that might be undertaken by foreign actors, is also to ignore that those same actors have been the cause of deforestation in the first place. And so I think it's very important to understand the interests of people who are working on the ground. And the proliferation of NGOs in Haiti really brings into relief just the excessive multiplication of projects that already exist in a sovereign version on Haitian soil. So tree nurseries are one example. Every peasants movement in the country has got tree nurseries. They would be able to distribute the saplings to peasants if they had money for gas and transportation to bring trucks deeply into the countryside, or have people carry the saplings to farmers who need them. And so rather than creating more tree nurseries and replicating something peasants movements are already doing, I view solidarity as, in its best iteration, being geared towards supporting resources and practices that already exist on the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your responses, and just want to say that a lot of these questions around solidarity and narrative have been coming in the chat. And so I guess one way to sort of consolidate a lot of these questions is specifically around the narrative that exists around Haiti. Several people in the audience have asked, what does it actually look like to conceive of and change those narratives? And I'll add to that, one of the members in the audience asked, how do we think about the narrative that exists around Haiti and changing that narrative, especially if we think about Black people in the US? So kind of expanding on this question of solidarity, and how do we think about Black solidarity? How do we think about how narrative changes can occur within our communities when it comes to Haiti specifically?
I would just say that I think the narrative around Haiti has existed for forever, in some ways almost blaming Haitians for their condition based on what they did in 1804, right? I mean, even after the earthquake, I don't know if you remember, some of you remember, Pat Robertson was claiming that this was a result of Haiti's pact with the devil to free themselves. And this is why this happened. And you always hear Haiti's a cursed country because of what happened in 1804. So in some ways, that narrative is there to sort of make the case that Haiti's in this situation because of what it did in 1804, as if it was a bad thing, as opposed to being truly celebrating a liberating thing that Haiti did. And I think that has perpetuated for centuries in terms of the narrative around Haiti being a poor country and not showing the history of Haiti. Very few people know the history that Sledge mentioned and Sophia mentioned about how Haiti was instrumental in us, the U.S. getting Louisiana Purchase, and all these great things that Haitians did. You never hear about that. All you hear about is the poverty and the challenges that Haiti has had over the decades.
The audacity of freedom, right? I think the President Barack Obama wrote The Audacity of Hope, but the audacity of freedom. How dare they free and liberate themselves, and then consequently liberate all Black nations around the world, right? Still paying that debt till this day. Colonialism is real, racism is real. It's been something that I feel like even us here in America want to ignore. They say, is there really a such thing as institutionalized racism? Of course. Is there a such thing as internationalized racism? I don't even know if that's a term, but I think you guys know where I'm going with that. But yes, and then the propaganda that has been perpetuated in the media that Haiti is the poorest country well, if we're so poor, what were they doing there? Why were our coffers emptied? Why is there deforestation? What are they drilling for? What are they mining for? What were the explorations being done for? So yes, poverty to me, in the sense of the Western world, it equates to finances. But if you're talking about culturally, if you're going back to Africa, richness is in the richness of the land, right? So if you strip the richness of the land, then the country becomes poor. But why was the land stripped? So, Haiti was known as the Pearl of the Antilles, the richest, colony or port there in the Caribbean. But to answer the questions that's posed, there's a lot that we can do to change that narrative. Starts off by educating yourself. Panel discussions such as this to get to the core root of the problems is very important. Also, those as a Haitian American, I've been naturalized. So I was born in Haiti. I came here at a very young age. My parents educated me here in the country. So now taking my education to advance the structural things in Haiti. So if my my fortitudes are in healthcare, so I need to take that information and that knowledge back home now and pass it on to the paysans, or the people down there that are inhabiting of the land right now to help them advance. And we all, as those that are in the diaspora that has a love or any type of relationship to Haiti, I feel there is an obligation for us to do so. And just the humanness of wanting to reach back and helping those that have helped us out greatly and paved the way for us to live the way that we're living. Again, without Haiti, America, as you know, it doesn't even exist at all.
Yeah, I think in relation to that point, something I emphasize in my work and something that I'd love to see centered in the narrative about Haiti that circulates is that, like, the work of the revolution, the liberatory work, which is what is maybe the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds when they think about Haiti, it didn't stop in 1804. It's like understanding that as an ongoing process that continued to transform people's lives in Haiti, but also to inspire Black people across the Americas, right? And so, as was mentioned, people in Venezuela, people in Brazil, people in the US South, not only engaged in their own liberatory struggles, but specifically cited Haiti as an inspiration and Haiti's revolution as an inspiration in their own struggle. And so understanding the process of liberation work that Haitians have undertaken as ongoing, as rooted in the revolution, but ongoing into the present, I think is really important. And one way that I try to do that is to think beyond Port-au-Prince. And a lot of work about Haiti, a lot of writing about Haiti really focuses on the city. but there are rural communities. This is why I focus on peasants' movements, right? Because they have a direct line to agrarian uprisings of the 18th century, the 19th century. So I'm interested in sort of expanding how we understand liberatory struggle as something that connects agrarian contexts across the Afro-Americas.
Thank you all for your responses. There's one other question that I think is geared towards all of you, and then there are a few that are more specific. So I'll ask this one general question and then move on to the more specific ones. But there's a comment here about creativity, and it seems like from all of your presentations, even though they're coming from different fields, you're talking about a level of creativity that exists in Haiti. And so if you could talk a little bit more about and this is coming specifically from Dr. Jacqueline Couty, who mentions that in her classes, she spends time talking about creativity and how Haiti has so many great writers, musicians, painters. And so if we can think about creativity more expansively, what do you think creativity and art, what role do they play in resistance to colonialism and oppression?
Yeah, I love that question. I think I would love to replace the word resilience with creativity. And I really have thought a lot about why it should be that Haitians should be labeled resilient, when in fact, as the anthropologist Michel Roth-Trio wrote in many of his works, is ordinary people living ordinary lives with a history that is extraordinary, but all the same, it's not exceptional that colonialism and empire have shaped the country, but the struggle, the creative revolt that Haitians have undertaken is in fact something that should be foregrounded. And what I tried to do, again, this hits on the changing the narrative conversation, is to really highlight not just surviving, but again, abundance and thriving and the creative ways that Haitians have made a way to live free in the countryside, despite all of the pressures that they have faced.
We, we decide what is important and what is not, what we place value on and what we don't place value on. So in regards to creativity, I spoke earlier about the cultural impact that Haiti has left. And cultural, that's music, that's art, and that's food, right? And just the way that the people, my people express themselves, we express ourselves, very expressive country. Now, the value that is placed on that, so in layman's terms, if you go to Gucci, right? Gucci versus some non-name brand leather from Peru or something. Now, the quality of leather from Peru may supersede that of the one that, that Gucci has, but the name recognition of Gucci, because the allure and the appeal and the marketing and the, that has been placed, now Gucci has value. So we place value on things and we make them important. As a very proud Haitian, it's always important for me to let it be known that, hey, I speak Creole, right? Although we speak French as well, I speak Creole. That's the mother tongue. That's the tongue of the paysan, right? That I deeply connect with. The music, compa, gabodai, or voodoo music, they say, hey, this is a cursed culture. This voodoo music. This is what they're eating. I don't understand it. So your understanding is limited because the value that you've placed on it, or the value that you've been taught to place on it, so now it has no bearing to you. So what we can do a better job at marketing ourselves, put in a higher value on the things that we love and that you may have already been exposed to, but you did not know that it was Haitian culture that influenced it because it wasn't taught. Yeah, so that's what I have to say about that. Beautiful question, by the way.
You know, it is a beautiful question. I'm going to approach it. I'm an engineer, as you know, so I'm going to approach it from a very engineering perspective. When I teach design, civil engineering design, or designing things, when we put constraints on students, you have to build something to go from here to there. You can't use this kind of material. You can't do this. That's when you find students are most creative in terms of how they solve problems, is when they're under multiple constraints. And when I think of my own family, my own life growing up for parents that immigrated to the US when I was a baby, and the constraints that they were under, I was just always amazed at the creativity my mother would show and my grandmother who lived with us in terms of just simple things like cooking. You talked about the talent that Haitian cooking, but my mother would take these various things in the kitchen and make an incredible meal for our large family. Because I think they've been so used to, as Haitians, operating under constraints, they've had to be creative in how they approach things. So that's how when I think about the creativity in Haiti, I believe it comes from just the incredible constraints that Haitians have been under for a variety of reasons.
Thank you all. This next question, there are a few questions for Dr. DeRoche, and I know that you have to leave a little bit before 8, so I'm going to ask these first. So let me just list both of them, and then you can decide how to answer. So the question, actually there are 3. So the first being, how can US universities best contribute to building a stronger Haiti? More specifically, what can faculty do to contribute? The next one is Dr. DeRoche particularly hightailed the power of the word when he presented the impact of the article he wrote with colleagues. I think that what linked to your presentation, oops. Nope, sorry, wrong one. There was a question about the economy. What type of partnership can the US do more with Haiti to help it build its economy? And this one can be answered by any panelist, but I'll present it to you as well. And then the final one being, so we're looking at 12 years after the earthquake. There was another earthquake last year as well. And so what is building and construction in the present look like, and thinking about it as we move towards the future? So those are the 3 questions.
And certainly the second question can be answered by anybody. I'll answer the first question from my role at Rice as provost and incoming president. In fact, coincidentally, I just was on the phone with the US Embassy in Haiti just this past week, talking to them about how we can establish a closer tie between Rice in particular and universities in Haiti. So, you know, certainly one of the things that we can do at Rice is be very proactive about getting students from Haiti in a variety of programs. I'm proud to see my own student here, Marc-Ancy Laguerre, who is a PhD student with me in civil engineering. And I know Mark hopes to go back to help build Haiti. And really the only way Haiti is going to move forward is if we get more Haitians here in the US coming to get educated and going back to Haiti and helping their country. And I know there are a lot of people like Mark that want to do that. And so my goal as an administrator at Rice is to try to really forge partnerships through various agencies in Haiti to try to get more Haitians here to the US. There are a lot of talented Haitian students in various parts of Haiti, and my goal is to try to get them here at Rice and perhaps in other places to study and go back and help the country in a variety of spaces. I think your last question was, where is Haiti in terms of building? I think there's been a lot of progress that's been made. Clearly, the last earthquake was problematic because it occurred at a time where it's very difficult to get goods in and to really recover and rebuild the country. There had been progress that had been made after the 2010 earthquake, particularly in the past 5 to 7 years before the most recent earthquake. There are a number of efforts on the ground working to train local Haitians, because it has to happen with local Haitians. You can't just have other countries coming in and building structures and not building the capacity within the community in Haiti to rebuild themselves. And I'm a stronger believer that the long-term success of Haiti is building capacity internally for them to rebuild. And there have been a number of efforts to do that. And I'm hopeful that will continue and accelerate when people like Mark go back to Haiti and are part of the solution and help them move forward.
Thank you. So I'll present the question again, since it's any of the panelists can answer it. So that second question was, what type of partnership can the US do more with Haiti to help it build its economy?
That's a loaded question. You know, there you can answer that so many different type of ways, but one thing that I'm proud of is the work that we were able to do here in Houston by partnering with our U.S. congressmen and women, Sheila Jackson Lee, and also Congressman Al Green, that were very instrumental in putting different policies that they presented to be voted on that will allocate funding for structural repairs of Haiti, and helping finance to a certain degree, and giving favorable contracts to Haitians to develop their own country, our own country down there. My organization has been very instrumental in those talks. So those are the things that we've taken upon ourselves to make a difference in, is the policies. Because if policies don't change on how you deal with the country, in essence, you're just going to continue perpetuating the ills that's been causing its devastation or its fall. I like there was a question, it wasn't asked to me, but Dr. DeRoche, but curriculum, I think curriculum from, universities around the country, the world, can really teach the importance and the value of the Haitian plight and the contributions that we've given. Even here in America, I don't think we do a good enough job of having a well-rounded curriculum of the impacts that others has played in American history, African history, Asian history, or whatever community that you're talking about. So I think that's very important. And I'm glad that Dr. DeRoche is there. My daughter is going to be transferring she is hoping to transfer to Rice and finish her studies in architecture. And she could study under you.
I think on the note of curriculum, I'm going to answer this question in a very specific way, but I think that the development of curricular resources, it speaks to not just what should other countries do or what should the US do, but how should they do it. And I have encountered a lot of NGO and bilateral organization members who are, for example, as Sledge mentioned, they're bringing materials in French. And the people who I work with don't speak or read French. They might speak Spanish, but they speak primarily Creole. And so, supporting Creole language learning in a broader context, not just in places with large Haitian diasporic populations, but in institutions across the country. And for people who want to help in Haiti, and just insisting that materials are accessible in the format and in the language that is accessible to the recipients, right? And so, for example, visual materials or auditory materials, the use of radio, the use of recorded audio, the use of visual materials that don't include a lot of text is going to be the most useful for peasants organized in movements like the ones I work with in Central Haiti. So really, first trying to understand the context before intervention is really important, and ensuring that that intervention is what beneficiaries want and that it's accessible to them and also is durable to them. I mean, I also think about stuff that maybe doesn't seem as shiny as big name projects, big budget projects, but preservation of archives is extremely important. Like if you visit the Bibliothèque Nationale in Port-au-Prince, the archivists are really, really struggling to preserve historical materials, and they don't have the resources, they don't have to control the climate in the building, to preserve these materials from the 18th century that are extremely fragile in a way that would help us to better understand the history of Haiti and its significance for the hemisphere in a broader context. So I think that's another sort of institutional intervention that institutions like Rice could be really useful for, is like, how could we help with digitizing? How could we help with archival resources? How can we preserve the history that is already present in Haiti before it's too late?
Thank you again for your responses. I just wanted to highlight that in the chat, there were several comments made along these lines of your responses. And I think it's important to note that that as someone said, it's not solidarity amongst Haitians, because that has existed all along generationally, but thinking about the solidarity across people, nations, Black diaspora, right? And so I think that all of you have brought so many rich examples of how this can be done, which I think is super important to the work when we think about Haiti's past, present, and future. And so I did want to just give you all a chance to provide any final closing words, if there's anything that you'd like to add before we close the event this evening.
Let me just, because I do have to run, let me just first thank you and the organizers and Tony for organizing this, and thank Sophia and Sledge for being here. I've learned a lot from you too also today. And, I hope we can all remember Haiti. It's an incredible, incredible country. It took me many years before I visited. I came when I was 1 year old, and I didn't go back until the earthquake. And it taught me a lot about my history and my culture. I mean, I was almost 40 years old at that point, over 40 years old at that point. And I learned a lot about just the incredible rich history and the people in Haiti. So I would encourage those who are on the Zoom to visit Haiti. You really only learn about Haiti when you visit and see how incredible the people are and how warm the people are, and I think you'll get a deeper appreciation for how special the country is, both historically and present. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you, Amarilys.
I guess I could just say that I feel it's the responsibility of all Americans, and by that I mean all North Americans, all Central Americans, all South Americans, people across the Americas, to understand Haiti's role, or Hispaniola's role even more broadly in the history of our hemisphere. And so, if you know about the American Revolution, but you don't know about the Haitian Revolution, that's a problem. And I think that making that a part of historical education, and even of like K through 12 curricula, is really important. And that's something that's ongoing now. There's a graphic novel about the Haitian Revolution. There's an animated series. There's the series Exterminate All the Brutes, right? Raoul Peck series that was excellent treatment of colonialism on Hispaniola. And so really like centering Haiti not as something exceptional in the hemisphere, but as a place that whose history helps us to understand our collective history in the hemisphere is really, really important, and something that, you don't have to be a scholar or an expert to do, something that just requires learning your basic geography and the role that Haiti's history has played in the development of our hemisphere.
In closing, I am very honored to have been part of this panel and discussion. So thank you for the opportunity. There's a Haitian quote on our flag. It's on our coat of arms. It says, "L'union fait la force." Very underrated. It means, it's in French, it says, there's strength in unity, there's power in unity. So unity, I think that's what gained us our freedoms when America wanted to liberate itself and free and become a sovereign nation from, Great Britain. They had to unify themselves, so they formed the Union. So that concept is such a powerful one, and it flies on our flag. So there has to be a common thread that draws us together. That common thread is the humanity. All right. So you see your brother and sister in need, that's paid a great debt to you, then the right thing to do would be to collaboratively come together to make an impact and make a difference. But it has to be a multilateral effect from many different sectors, many different nations and countries. I would love to see discussions from world leaders sitting down and discussing Haiti. I would love to see that. I know they have even in the United Nations. I would love for them to sit down and discuss Haiti, put Haiti on the agenda. The African nations, the Union of African Nations, or the Union of Caribbean Nations, or all of it, make Haiti an agenda topic, and go from there. And from the university levels to the people that have nonprofits here and just the philanthropic thought process, reach out to our organization, Houston Haitians United. You can find us at info@houstonhaitiansunited.org. Send an email. We have phone numbers, contacts that you can reach out to us. There's many ways that you can help and assist and offer your services. And of course, financial contributions also goes a long ways. I'm not here to ask for money, but if there's families out there that may benefit from your resources, we are a great avenue to help connect you with that. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. DeRoche, Dr. Moore, Mr. Leonidas, for your time, for your brilliance on this panel today, on this event. And I wanted to actually, there's a last comment that came in from Jan West, and I wanted to just share it because I think it just speaks to the power of this panel today. And so the comment says, this has been a thought-provoking discussion that in my home at least will continue once the presentation ends. My great-grandmother came to the US from Haiti by way of France. My husband and I talk frequently about the impact of Haiti on the world and the cultural pride that we find in the leadership that led to the revolution. Kudos for creating this talk. I saw personally the creativity discussed in the ways that my grandmother moved in this world. Thanks so much to all the organizers. So I just want to echo Jan West's words and saying thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And please stay in touch via the CAAS website and learn more about upcoming events. So thank you one last time to Mr. Leonidas, Dr. Moore, and Dr. DeRoche for an excellent panel. And good evening, everyone. See you next time.